Okay. Walang sabit dito. Perfect, perfect. Okay, tapat mo na lang sa gusto mo. Okay na yun. Teka mo, last ikot na lang yun. Huwag mo naman. Ikot pa yun. Huwag mo na. Wala, okay na yan. Huwag mo na yan mo, nakat ka pa sa taas mo, sugitin mo yung taas mo. Susugitin mo yung pula ron, kapiraso. Perfect! Okay na?
Yon. Magandang gabi mga karadyo. It is already 12 a.m. and we're actually recording one session of, I think this is session 10 of episode 10 of Radyo at Kape. And we have a very special guest today who's joining us to talk more about his journey in in the ham radio community. And hopefully, he could also bring some expertise dito sa discussion natin today. So again, this is Nash, amateur call sign N2RAC, also known as 4 Echo 1 Foxtrot Lima Delta. And I'll be passing the mic to Angelo to introduce our guest.
Okay, so good day everyone and happy weekend. And this episode is so special, I dressed up for it. So may pants ako ah. It's not just the jacket, may pants din. Tsaka actually it's my brother's wedding. So shout out to my brother Vince and congratulations to Vince and Trish on your successful wedding day. Finally, after 2 years of planning, preparations, and a lot of effort. So this episode is special. We do have our guest, si Master Ari Trofeo, 4I1 Bravo Lima, and one of the experts in a lot of things. So we turn to Ari when it comes to HF, antennas, radios. Kung may tanong kayo, malamang alam ni Master Ari yan. And hindi nyo natatanong, Ari has a killer IMDb profile. So check niyo IMDb ni Ari. Nako, ang daming mga pelikula na Oscar nominated ba na award-winning and internationally acclaimed. Ari has been involved in cinema production. Pero isa yan sa mga mga interests niya. So before anything, Ari, I'd like you to introduce yourself. By the way, this is Angelo for I1 REC, also known as N2RAC, and this is episode 9. Ay, 9 ba? 10, episode 10 of Radyo at Kape. Over to you, Boss Ari. An short introduction before we start with the show proper.
Okay, thank you, Tito Angelo. Thanks, Tito Nash, for having me. At pasensya na medyo na late yung dating. Back to normal na talaga. Sobrang traffic na sa labas. At ang layo ng airport papunta dito sa bahay. So, yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Ari Trofeo. My amateur call sign is 4 India 1 Bravo Lima. Or most people call me just BBL for short. I've been an amateur since for about 3 years now. But my experience in radio dates back to my early years of high school. Uh, Niregaluhan ako ng tito ko ng CB radio, and it all started from there. I gained friends, I gained experience, most especially in home brewing antennas, and somehow people have come to know me as the antenna maker in the radio circles, and I'd like to think that hopefully I can share something useful to everybody today. Um, Although my profession doesn't really have anything much to do with radio, it's just been my biggest passion and hobby ever since. I'm working in film and TV production, as Tito Angelo mentioned, but it's also through one of my projects that I became more immersed in building and setting up radio stations. This is specific to the Survivor series of shows. If you're familiar, no, yung ibang countries nagpupunta sila dito sa Philippines to shoot uh, their Survivor series sa mga isla-isla. So that time, my local producer found out that I was into radio, and then sabi niya, hey, why not tayo na lang yung mag-set up ng mga repeaters, and let's program all the handhelds and all the repeaters, and you design the systems, ganyan. So basically, lumawak yung experience ko sa radio, and because of that kind of exposure, para bang na-validate yung mga dati ko nang ginagawa, dati ko nang nakasanayan when I was into CB and HF in my early days. I was also a member of the club station at the university nung college ako. So somehow, meron na rin akong konting exposure back then, but when I worked in Survivor, siguro mas napatibay yung mga alam ko na, and then there were some things that I had to relearn again. Ganun pala yun, no, Tito Nash. There's no exception dito. Just as in every hobby, it's a source of pride kasi minsan, yung maging self-taught ka. There are a lot of things that you discover on your own. Minsan nagiging source yan ng pride mo as a hobbyist, no? And it could go either way. You can share it, or you can maybe somehow just keep it to yourself for some reason, di ba? Pero my point being that it's good to know that yung learning natin sa hobby na to, it's a continuous process. That's why, if I may, Tito Angelo, yung nasabi mo kanina na I think you referred to me as an expert, I'd like to disagree with that one a bit, because
Yeah.
I'd like to think na there's no such thing as being an expert in this field or in any other field, because siguro yan yung pinaka-dangerous na point, when you feel that there's nothing new to learn. Parang nag-stop ka na doon, and you feel as if everything is already here in your head. Parang I'd like to believe that every day, every situation, every radio setup, every antenna puzzle, or every propagation what do you call that? Any radio situation will always teach you something new. So parang there's no end to our learning. It's a continuous process. But anyway, going back to that, no, yun. So I worked in that reality show, and when I came back, meron kasi akong boss doon na foreigner. So para bang na-undo yung mga bad habits na napulot ko on my own. So what I'm trying to share is that it's good to be discovering things on your own, but in the same way, you also be open to discussion. You be open to other people showing you their work, para it becomes a collaborative effort. Because sometimes marami tayong mga nadi-discover on our own. In the same way, marami rin tayong nade-develop na bad habits without knowing, no one telling us that they're bad habits. So nakakasanayan natin, and they become bad practices. So it's good once in a while to validate our work. Look at other people's work also, and make sure that we're doing the right thing. Hindi lang yung puro, oh, kita mo yan, gawa ko yan. Kita mo to, gawa ko to. Be open also to what other people are doing. And in the same way, you're contributing to them. And they're also contributing to you. Tito Nash, before we started, I remember you said that you're just fairly new to the hobby. And sabi mo, you're just a tiny drop, in coming into this big ocean. So parang sabi mo, the ocean, it's like so overwhelmingly large compared to you. Pero I'd like you to also look at it the other way around, that even with this tiny drop going into the ocean becomes bigger. So that means yung experience that you're bringing in, or the curiosity that you're bringing in for all those potential new learnings, also makes the ocean bigger because you're there. So thanks for bringing that up, because we're all the tiny drops that make up that ocean. And yun, sorry ang haba ng intro ko sa
Yeah, very
sarili
good
ko.
insights, Tito Ari. And tama nga sabi mo, parang true wisdom is knowing that you don't know everything nga naman, di ba? And everyone has something to contribute. And yung curiosity mo, your hunger for knowledge. Sabi nga namin, hindi naman kami expert eh. Nagsishare lang din kami ng nalalaman namin na experiences kaya insights. Okay, so bago natin ibalik kay Nash. So, Tito Ari, one of the
Yes.
last week we discussed antenna building, antennas. Last week we discussed 2 meter, 70 centimeter, yung dual bander. Ngayon,
Yes.
nahuhumaling kami ni Nash ngayon sa HF. At ito yung isa sa napakamahal na hobby. Pwede namang hindi mahal, pero alam ko mahilig kang gumawa ng antennas, So, how do we get started with building antennas for HF? Ano ba yung pinaka-basic? Kasi alam ko si Dash, ang dami niya nagastos eh. Magkano ba yung yung antenna mo na 20 mil ba yan?
Hindi.
Yun, diba? Yung sabi nila, 100 watts in a wire, okay ka na. Di ba? Yung wire, magkano lang? Ilan daang piso lang. So how do we get started with HF? Alam ko marami sa atin yan ang gusto. Pero na kami we're parang wow, kailangan haba, kailangan malaki, kailangan mahal, kailangan malaking bahay mo. So kami? Paano kaya
Tapos, ang dami na naming tinesting na antena. Minsan kami ni Angelo, napapakamot yung ulo. Sabi namin, ano ba to? This is as good as a dummy load.
Mag-messenger na lang kami.
At least laging full scale, di ba?
Oo.
Kasi minsan nagte-testing kami ni Angelo eh. So, madalas kami ni Angelo yung nagte-testing. So, sabi ko sa Angelo, I'm traveling. Dinig mo ba? Wala pare. Teka, tignan mo. I-record ko para sa Facebook. Sasend ko na lang sa'yo. Wala talaga eh.
Sabi ko nga na lang tayo. Mag-VHF na lang tayo eh. Andiyan ka lang naman. Ito lang naman ako. Hindi tayo magkaranigan sa HF. Ano bang magandang simula, Tito Ari?
Okay, dito. It's good na bring up mo yung 2 meter and UHF, because syempre as hams at our disposal yan di ba? We have a very broad frequency range to work with. And the first thing really, I guess for us, is to be aware of the differences between 2 meter and 70 and HF in terms of the distances covered, the nature of propagation, di ba? Like so VHF, it's fairly simple because 90% of the time it's just line of sight, and the rest it's reflection, or in very rare instances you have all those ducting modes, sa ionosphere, and other special propagation conditions that affect VHF and UHF. Siyempre yung naiba lang naman talaga, as you mentioned, sa HF, ang pinag-uusapan talaga is the size of the antenna. Naturally related to the wavelength that you're operating on. Sa 2 meter, it's fairly manageable, lalo na sa UHF. The antennas are very easy to make. The materials are very easy to come by. They're very light. They're very portable. Pagdating sa HF, mabubulaga ka, di ba? Kasi yung joke nga namin is pag gumagawa ka ng aluminum antenna sa HF, yung mga pinagputulan mo, kikita ka pa dyan kasi magagawa mo pa siyang VHF antenna saka UHF. Di ba? Yung mga short na ano, pag nagtutono ka na, okay, pwede pang ano yan, pwede pang dipole yan sa ano, sa 2 meter or sa 70. Kasi gano'n nakaliit, di ba? But let's not be discouraged because although the HF antennas are large when you stick to the formulas, when you compute them, we'd want everybody to be aware na marami kang ibang options, not just a horizontal dipole or yung tinatawag na sampayan. Of course, it's the most basic because one, you just cut one side, quarter wave, and then doblehin mo, and then you put an insulator in the middle, you attach your coax, it's your choice whether you attach a balan or do a direct feed. Maybe you put some ferrite beads to stop the RF from running down the coax, and then insulator sa dulo, and then tie it off. Minsan pa nga, ano yan, magiging sloper, minsan magiging inverted V. Pero the sad part is kahit sabihin mo sa 40 meters, because that's usually the entry level band, yung 40 meters. Because of the license privileges, yung sa Class C, you're allowed sa 40, and that's where most of the action is actually in terms of local contacts and of course the DX also arrives on 40 most of the time. Malaki ang ano di ba? Malaki ang dipole mo for 40. You're talking about 66 feet. And for most average city dwellers, mahirap na yung 66 feet kahit nga yung 33 feet lang na quarter wave mahirap na yon. But there are options for antennas. But what we want to do here is we're not going to enumerate all the options, but to make people aware that once you understand how you can work with the dipole, you can build other antennas that are derived from the dipole, because the dipole is probably the most basic antenna that you can ever think of. No? And yun, so we can have verticals because, for example, the mobile antennas, diba? It's possible to do 40 meters or 20 or 15 or 10. You have mobile antennas available, but again, every antenna is a compromise. What do we mean by that? Okay, yung antenna kasi dalawa yung sukat niyan. You have a physical length and you have the electrical length. This, by the way, this applies also to VHF and to UHF. No, this applies to the entire radio spectrum, if you want to call it that. But what we want to have is like you said, no, yung nagte-testing kayo na I can't hear you, I'm mobile now. Dinig mo ba ako, most of the time yung conversation nyo takes place in Messenger. Tapos yung sa radyo, puro noise lang, di ba? I'd like you to think of it the other way. Na most of the time we'll think that our signal is not strong enough. But what if you think about it the other way, that your signal is actually being eaten up by the noise that your antenna is picking up. So your signal is there, but you have a very high noise floor. Diba? So si Tito Angelo mentioned that we have to go back to the basics. Okay, if we want to go back to the basics, literally, let's start from the ground. Okay, so ground, literally ground. You hear the term a lot sa radyo. If we go to basic electronics, the concept says that for any current to exist or current to flow, you need at least two conductors to close the circuit. One to carry the charges from the source to the load, and the other wire from the load to the source. So it goes around, right? Because if it's broken, then you don't have a closed circuit. right? And when you have an open circuit, then there's no current existing, nothing is happening. Okay, so how do we apply that to our radio analogy? Tito Nash, you're there sa Marikina. Ako, I'm here sa Quezon City.
Mhm.
But the only thing, we're separated by physical distance. But even Tito Angelo, the thing that's common to the three of us now is the ground that we're standing on. That's the earth, diba? That's the biggest conductor that you'll ever have. And luckily, in our antenna circuit, that's already existing. All we have to do is tap into it. Because lahat tayo wherever you are in the world, most probably you're already linked to the ground. Okay? So, okay, sasabihin nyo, baka may mamimiloso pa dyan and say, no, what about aeronautical mobile, di ba? Oh, let's go to that later. How about maritime mobile, di ba? Ang maritime mobile, you're actually sitting on one of the best conductors, salt water. Di ba? But still, the salt water has a connection with the ground because the ground is also made more conductive by water.
Yes.
Di ba? So, okay, so we have our antennas. Now, think like between our antennas is just a giant resistor. Very, very high value because that's air in between. But it's still a resistor. Diba? So the least we can do is have a solid connection between my ground and your ground. And that's already taking care of half of the problem. Right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Enlightening yan.
So,
Sorry.
Enlightening tong discussion na to. Parang gumanon yung utak ko.
so it's again, 'di ba? Yung physics doesn't change. 'Di ba? Magbago yung equipment mo, paliit ng paliit yung radyo natin. But the physics is there. All we have to do is tap into that existing concept already. So meron tayong ground. Now, we have to make a distinction between what we call DC ground and RF ground. I'm sure in the VHF and UHF antennas, it's easier for you to see the ground radials, di ba? But why does it require you that when you have, for example, an omnidirectional antenna that has radials, why are you still advised to have a grounding rod where your coax enters your shack, or maybe a grounding rod at the point where your mast meets your support, ground support, di ba? So we're addressing two things there. There's a distinction. Yung radials mo are forming what they call the RF ground, so that it will, when you transmit or when you receive, your antenna is pushing or sitting against a solid ground or a very effective ground, which is yung radials mo. But the ground rod is there for DC protection. So you have your lightning strikes, you have your static buildup. That's one way of, again, lessening the noise. Again, go back to that mindset that don't think that your signal or your transmission is weak. Think that the receiving station has a lot of noise. So when we want to transmit far, you actually have to think about receiving well first. Because whenever you plan on setting up a station, before you decide on what antenna you want to put or how high you want to go or how much how much you want to spend, maybe gawin natin yan sa mental flowchart natin when we're setting up a station. Check muna with the temporary antenna, how much noise are we getting? Especially now at this time. Ang dami-dami natin sources of interference. We have switching supplies, we have LED lamps, we have all sorts of new appliances that use inverters that run on square waves. And those are the things na pumapatay sa hobby natin. Maybe a few years back or a few decades back, it wasn't really a problem kasi halos lahat ng power supplies were all linear. But now, our focus really is on fighting that noise. It's a modern day problem. So once you know how to take care of noise, automatically your transmission and reception will improve. So ganun, parang nanganganak yung solution mo. It's a side effect of fixing noise. Pero if you want to talk far, try to listen far first. Di ba? That's why nga sinasabi natin na bakit ka mag-booster? You're only helping your transmit. What's the use? You're not helping or you're not promoting two-way communications that way. Maririnig ka nila, but kung mag-reply sila sa'yo, yung mga exotic na DX, makokopya ka nila, but will you hear them? Most likely not, di ba? So that's one of the insights I want to share. Now, first, let's work on grounding. Okay, number 2. So we have several options of antennas to use, but if you're not sure of how much noise you're getting in your QTH, then start with a basic dipole muna. Para naman hindi ka ma-disappoint, bibili ka ng branded antenna tapos lahat ng masasagap mo S9 plus 10 noise
Parang ako
floor.
yun eh. Parang ako yung Kuya
Ay,
Ari,
sorry.
diba? Nakapunta ka sa bahay ko, di ba?
Pinasamahan mo.
Di ba nakapunta ka sa bahay ko? When we had
Yes.
that conversation, Angelo, just to share.
Yeah.
So, nandito si Kuya Ari at si Doc Nilo. So, they check my setup. Alam mo kung na-identify nila na biggest problem ko? It's my guy wires. Kasi my guy wires are probably radiating as well. Kasi they're not broken. So, that was one of the biggest problems. So, you have an antenna, you have a vertical antenna, then it was super noisy. Wala akong madinig. Someone can hear me, but I couldn't hear anyone. So, that was one of my biggest problem. So, yun, when I entered the hobby, so it was like, sabi nila, maganda to, ito, maganda ikabit. So, I fell into that trap. I bought the antenna, installed it, got like a nice cable for it. And then when I turned on my radio, puro hash. So, naalala ko lang. So, sorry Kuya Ari, go ahead.
Okay. So, yun. So, I'd like to officially welcome you to SMB. Okay, SMB, it's not the drink. Okay, it's not the brown bottle I'm talking about. It's just we've all been part of that, no? I'd like to since we're new to the hobby, marami tayong napagtatanungan. And I'd like you to be aware that if, for example, magtanong ka sa ibang ham, hey, what's the best antenna? Most probably, ang sasabihin niya sa'yo is the antenna that he has at his station. Okay. But this is one thing that you have to consider also. Even before the antenna, your range or the effectiveness of your station is your location. Pero for most of us, that's already a given. Dahil meron na tayong mga existing na bahay before we got into the hobby. For the lucky few na ngayon pa lang or pwedeng bumili ng extra house, you can choose, di ba? Kung saan mo gusto, yung mataas or tabing dagat, things like that. Those factors that help your signal get out. But for the 99% who already have their QTH before they decided to go on radio, first thing is you find out from that person na nag-refer sa'yo, sabihin niya, oh, ano ba yung antenna na malakas? Sabihin niya, ito, bumili ka ng ganito, ito yung pinakamalakas bumato for me. Nakailan palit na ako, ito na yung nag-stick na ako with this model, with this brand. Don't take it as gospel truth. It could be a good performing antenna to begin with. But second question you should ask is, where are you located and how high is it mounted? Because definitely mauuwi yan sa location, because the antenna is very dependent on location. It's also very dependent on your mounting situation. If there's kung nauso yung term na social distancing, during this time of pandemic, social distancing was already being observed by antennas since the early days of RF. Because antennas don't like sitting beside each other. And yung spacing nila is not social distancing of 6 feet. yung social distancing nila is very dependent on the wavelength that you're operating on. So usually it's good practice na at least one wavelength, but it will again depend on whether you're separating horizontal antennas or vertical antennas. Because vertical antennas, you don't put vertical antennas side by side because they're in each other's patterns. So vertical antennas, you separate them vertically. In the same way, horizontal antennas, you separate them also vertically. Because when you have antennas that are facing each other or one facing the back of another, kahit, kahit magkaibang band yan, there's a lot of interaction that happens. There's a lot of uh, what do you call that, induced currents dun sa kabila. So if one antenna is transmitting and the other is receiving, there's a big chance that you can overload the receiver of the receiving radio. So kawawa naman siya. Even if they're not related in terms of bands, no, ang mamamatay doon is most probably yung first RF amp niya, or even madadamage yung bandpass filter niya if it's really that strong. But the point being, whenever you're setting up or planning on setting up an antenna, wag mong ibuhos lahat ng budget mo doon sa antenna. You think about the support. Number one, if you buy a branded antenna tapos ang na-afford mong tubo is just 20 feet, baka naman hindi mo makuha yung performance that the antenna is promising. Madi-disappoint ka lang. Ang laki ng ginastos mo. And then sabihin mo, mas malakas pa yung alambre ko dito eh. Ito branded to. Because probably that part of the manual that says na these measurements or these specs were taken this high from the ground. Tapos hindi mo nagawa yung ganun height. Then it's also unfair, to your equipment, that you're going to blame the equipment, but you did not distribute your resources well enough. It could be a short or low support that put your antenna there and it was underperforming, or maybe you bought a high enough support but you got a cheaper cable. So all these factors, they come into that equation. Because if you can have the tallest tower, but if you don't have much left to buy a good cable, then sayang lang kasi yung whatever you gain in height, kakainin lang yun ng cable mo on the way to the radio. Diba? There are scenarios like that. Of course, in HF, we're not too particular about cable losses. Not like in VHF or more so in UHF. No? Cable losses are more critical. Mas bilang yung dB loss sa cable. Sa HF, it's not really that much. Pero still, the rules apply. The longer cables will eat up more signal. Will eat up more signal during transmit and during receive. So these are some points to sort of
Consider.
think about when you're planning your station. But first, think about the location and then decide whether if you have, sa HF ganito, before you put all your cash in that expensive antenna, mag-test ka muna sa dipole just to have a feel of the noise around your neighborhood. Baka yung barangay ninyo nag-install sila ng bagong CCTVs. Meron silang mga solar street lamps. Unfortunately, all these new technologies, meron siyang sort of kapalit eh. And ang laki ng impact sa hobby natin in terms of noise pollution, RF noise. And those are those are sort of modern day evil na yan eh, 'di ba? So ang isa-suggest ko lang, if you have a very high noise environment, you'd be open to the possibility of having two antennas. You have a loop for receiving, because loops are known to be very quiet. And you have maybe a vertical for transmitting. So
Okay.
most radios have two antenna ports that you can set, no? Isa pang receive, isa pang transmit. Or you can have this yung mga third party na antenna relays. Automatic, no? RF triggered siya, or maybe you can make one of your own from yung the linear amp port sa likod ng HF radio, the one that triggers a relay. You can make your own antenna relay and choose between receive and transmit antenna. So it's one of those workarounds, no? Na you get the best of both worlds. You transmit using a vertical, which is omnidirectional. You get very low angle radiation also for DX. You get a little bit of skywave, but if you really want to specialize in NVs, then nothing will beat a low dipole. Because if you want to go farther, then you raise your antenna higher. What do we mean by higher? The rule of thumb for any antenna, or for HF for that matter, is at least half wavelength. But for us to raise your wire dipole 66 feet up, which is half wavelength for 40, medyo impractical na yon for most. So, the others naman, meron ka naman, Tito Nash, ito alam ko na, experience mo rin to. Instead of having two high supports, no, to hang your dipole, sorry, excuse me, naman ako. Daldal ko, no? Tito Nash, yung naging situation mo dati, you had a very tall support because mainly you were operating on 2 meter and 70. Nothing wrong with having a tall support because you were working on line of sight. Pero dun mo rin sinabit yung multiband dipole mo. The first thing that you have to be careful with when you have a multiband dipole or you have a single band dipole, kapag ginamit mo siya in inverted V, is not okay. Let's go with the monoband dipole. Monoband dipole has two sides, quarter wave, quarter wave. So in free space, or sabi nila, well, practically speaking, no, when you ignore the effects of the earth or whatever objects around the antenna, sabi nila the average impedance value of the theoretical dipole is about 73 ohms. Yung straight dipole yon. But since we don't have two supports, sabi nila we can bend. You keep the feed point high and bend the ends lower. Another consequence of that is when you bend the arms down, you lower the impedance value that will give you the best match closest to 50 ohms. Okay, because ayan, 70, 60, 50, di ba parang ganun eh, di ba? But again, those there's no set angle because tayo, iba-iba yung situation natin. You might have guy wires around, you might have metal around this point, or maybe another house or another roof or a steel fence. So these values, there's no set angle to give you the 50 ohm point because you'll be adjusting the angle, you'll be trimming the wire to tune. And sometimes physically you have a support that's too high and your angle will be very, very small. And what did you experience, Tito Nash, when you had a dipole that was very steep?
Yan, mahirap mag-DX. Sortihan.
Mahirap.
It's like and also the noise level is very 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 high, similar to para ka rin nag-vertical. Para ka din naka-vertical. Pero mas maganda lang yung receive niya.
Okay. Sige. So ito may konting theory to when we close, you keep approaching, you keep closing the angle. You have to remember this is quarter wave, this is quarter wave. When you keep closing the angle, so you actually approach the point where it becomes zero. Kasi di ba, nandito yung maximum value mo, 73. And then somewhere in between, you'll find 50. And then why does it become 0? Diba? Now, this will tell you, okay, this is quarter wave, this is quarter wave. Open dito, connected sa coax dito. Hey, wait, this looks familiar.
Folded ba yan? Dipole? Tao dyan?
No,
Hindi.
this is already a quarter wave stub. So your antenna, when it's like that, it's an antenna. But when your conductors are
Analog.
parallel, you're already running a transmission line. You made your antenna into a transmission line. But not just any transmission line. It became a quarter wave transformer. Because a quarter wave transformer, di ba, they use it for impedance matching. Yung tinatawag nila na matching stub. You'll find that in loops or in phasing harnesses, there's always a length na specific to converting one impedance value to another. So in this case, yung open circuit mo dito becomes 0 at one end, at that frequency where it's quarter wave. So that's why dito Nash, it probably explained why halos wala ka nang mapulot, wala ka na rin mabato, because you thought you had an antenna, but actually it was closer to being a transmission line already because of the angle.
Interesting. Very interesting. Tapos,
Come on.
di ba kasi we were talking about di ba the impedance going down. So, of course, the tuning of the antenna is a little bit harder. So that's why I could never tune that antenna using the internal tuner of the 991A. I had to use an external tuner just to be able to use it. At least maging usable siya for localized communication.
Yeah. Well, the thing about tuners, no? So you have internal and you have external. The sad part about internal tuners is that they can only handle a maximum SWR of about 3.0.
Yeah, 3 to 1.
Anything, anything above that, hindi na niya kakayanin. So that's when you need an external tuner. But of course, when you're operating portable, extra bit yun yung external. So I'd like to think na yung internal tuner, as much as you can, just use it when it's like a emergency situation na wala ka ng ibang choice sa antenna. Or any tuner for that matter. Because syempre, you have the most efficient energy transfer when you're not having a tuner in between your transmitter and your antenna. Because the cable alone is already contributing some loss. So what more kung dumaan ka pa sa tuner? Because your tuner is actually only sort of tricking the radio into believing that your load is matched to your coax, but actually it's not.
Tanong ako sa'yo dyan, Tito Ari.
Yes, Tito Angelo.
You mentioned yung portable. Siguro kaya marami rin natutuwa sa mga portable operations like Parks on the Air, Summits on the Air, kasi nga kung yung bahay mo nga naman ay nasa gitna ng RF-rich environment, wala kang choice but to go mobile, to go portable, ano? Siguro that's one reason, ano? It's a good challenge. Pwede naman din nakakapatay ng enjoyment kung nasa bahay ka. So, nabanggit mo ngayon tuner, Tito Ari. It's a very, alam ko, hotly contested question yan, issue sa ibang groups, ano? So, what is a tuner? Totoo ba na pag meron kang wire na ibang resonant in another frequency, you can optimize it for another frequency, another band, na kahit hindi siya optimized for that band? Are you just tricking your antenna, or are you also improving on your transmission and receiving when you match impedance and capacitance of your system using a tuner? Tama ba? Tuner ba ang tawag doon, or do you call it matcher? Ano bang magandang dyan?
Actually, both terms apply naman. Antenna matcher, antenna tuner, ATU. Diba? So, yung uso nga ngayon is yung automatic na. So, sinesense niya yung meron siyang circuit that measures SWR, and automatically, it adjusts for minimum reflection. Of course, we won't go into SWR anymore, but we know that it can be damaging sa radyo kapag mataas yung SWR. And also, it's very inefficient kasi yung radio mo, when it senses a high SWR at the coax, automatically nagbabawas yan ng power to protect your PA, or what we call yung finals, para hindi siya mag-absorb ng mataas na reflected power. Because ideally, di ba, everything that we're outputting from the radio, dapat mapunta yan sa air. Pero unfortunately, it doesn't happen in all cases, no? So especially sa HF, kasi we're always compromised nga in terms of space. So lahat ng antennas natin na may encounter will not always be the perfect antennas kasi most likely mas maliit yan than ideal. Especially when we're operating portable kasi kailangan yung madaling set up, or in the case of emergency communication, sometimes you have to you have to improvise. You just use what you find. Another note dito, Angelo, dun sa working on portable or mobile is especially yung mga nakatira sa condo. When you're very restricted, yun na siguro yung best option mo. Don't force the issue of operating, from a tiny balcony. Kasi again, we're talking about an antenna that's measured in terms of fractions of the wavelength that you're operating on. So kung sa HF, medyo compromised ka talaga. Not to mention yung noise pollution mo that's possible in a high-rise. Because nandun lahat ng appliances mo, and a lot of it is not within your control dahil galing sa mga kapitbahay mo yan. And you share the same power lines, and God knows what equipment they're running or what unbranded LED lamps they're running that's polluting all the circuits in the neighborhood. So when you're operating portable, it's a very good avenue to be experimenting on antennas. Kasi sa portable, it allows you to find the best location, yung lowest noise, yung best vantage point. So you can actually tailor your station based on what you need. If you're operating 2 and 70, then akyat ka lang sa Antipolo, mag-drive ka lang dun sa malapit sa Cloud9, and you take visual cues, di ba? Makikita mo ang daming repeaters naka-set up doon. So this must be the spot for me, di ba? Mag-operate ka sa Tagaytay. I know si Tito Nash madalas din doon minsan. But what works sometimes, what works for HF doesn't necessarily work for VHF and UHF. Because sa HF, sometimes it's better for you to be close to a body of water. And usually, walang body of water kung nasa tuktok ka ng bundok, unless it's a big enough lake, di ba? But the point being, sa HF, you try to prioritize your grounding. Again, di ba? Yung tinutungtungan natin lahat. And unfortunately, when you're mobile, you feel it most kasi, okay, sabihin mong metal body yung sasakyan mo, but your metal body is running on insulators. Apat yung gulong mo and rubber is the best insulator that you probably find. Diba? So you have a grounding shell. It's just a shell, pero wala ka talagang solid link to the ground. The only thing that's connecting you to the ground is because of your clearance with the ground and the metal body. You have that little bit of capacitance that's linking your vehicle to the ground, to the earth. So the higher your vehicle, the less capacitance kasi bigger yung spacing mo.
Kami ni Nash yan.
Angelo,
Diba?
mukhang kailangan natin pa-lowered yung pickup natin.
Oo nga
Kasama rin ako dyan,
kami,
diba? Kasama rin ako dyan, di ba? Kasi mahilig tayo mag-trail, mahilig tayo mag-go anywhere vehicle, di ba? So,
tuhulog kami ng wire sa habang umaandar.
So the next best thing is, yun na nga, pag nakapark ka, aside from having the body ground, if you're operating a mobile antenna, that is, mag-attach ka ng radials doon sa mo. And then ilatag mo lang doon. Radials. And okay, it's a hairy question yung radials. Gaano kahaba and gaano kadami? Diba? Okay, if we say na the minimum number of radials is 16, parang ang daming mapapakamot ulo, di ba? Wow, ang daming alambre niyan. Tapos sasabihin mo, quarter wavelength long. Kasi 40 meters, that's 33 feet each. Parang, wow, medyo impractical na siya. It borders that point, na Parang mag-VHF na lang kaya ako kasi ganun din pala yung requirement. Pero fortunately, when there's a question there, the next question there is, yung radials mo ba ilalatag mo sa ground or are they going to be elevated and under tension? Because kung yung radials mo will be elevated, for example, meron kang stand, and then nandito yung feed point mo, yung radials mo will be stretched. That's the time na you can observe yung quarter wave rule. Quarter wave, 33 feet, 33 feet, 33 feet. Sige, palagay mo ng minimum of 3 because you're traveling. But when you have radials na ilalatag mo sa ground, the length is not critical because it's already altered by the grounding. I mean by the ground surface. So you can have something like random. Maglagay ka dyan ng 3 8 feet, 3 16 feet. You know, you vary. Assorted. And that will help you a lot. Kasi in terms of grounding, mas effective yung madaming maliliit kesa yung isang mahaba. That's one thing.
Very quick question. So I saw this photo that you sent me. Nakita ko dito, is this like a grounding na kinabit nyo dun sa mast ng antenna? Na there's like wire rods. Tapos I saw that you also installed like a mesh. What is that about?
Yes. Well, this was for the 40-meter vertical of Tito Dennis. And the idea there is, it was a full-size quarter wave. So at 40 meters, that translates to about 33 feet. So 33 feet is tall enough, no, from the ground, is tall enough to be above the tree line, the roof line of the neighboring structures. Ibig sabihin, we didn't have to put it on a mast already. And the reason for that also is because we wanted to have a good solid connection sa ground. So what we did sa grounding is, let's have as much metal as possible in contact with the ground. So when we did the foundation, nagbaon kami ng mga steel rods, and ang ano namin dito is, we would have wanted, you know, in an ideal world, we would have wanted to use copper or brass or something that would last long. Pero ang target namin dito before was just to have a sort of experiment lang na proof of concept lang kami. So sige, let's just use mag-junk shop muna tayo, bili tayo ng mga bakal, ibaon natin. So meron straight down, tapos meron mga 1 foot below, kinalat namin around the surface, no, around the antenna. So parang radials, naging radials in a way, pero binaon namin sa lupa. And on top of that, we sort of treated the soil. We put some salt. Nagkalat kami ng salt and nagkalat din kami ng charcoal. So yung charcoal basically keeps the moisture and yung salt improves the conductivity of the soil. But in most cases naman, kung nandito ka you're talking about the Philippines, maganda naman yung conductivity ng soil natin because being in a tropical region, no, the soil is wet most times of the year. So mataas ang moisture content. So which means that grounding will always be successful, you know, even with just a few feet. But again, that's why we did yung vertical. So we wanted to go deep down. That's for the DC grounding. And then yung RF grounding was yung malawak na surface area in the immediate vicinity of the antenna. Because that's the only way na magkakaroon ka ng effective na grounding at 40 meters. This is trivia sa inyo dito, Nash. I'm not sure if you're already familiar with this observation. If you listen to yung mga AM stations, kapag nagsa-sign off sila, pakinggan niyo yung mga location ng transmitters nila. Most of the time, you'll find that AM stations are situated somewhere in Bulacan.
Malapit sa dagat. Tsaka yung mga malapit sa...
Di ba? Malapit sa dagat and malapit sa marshlands, sa swamplands.
Kasi I remember there's like an AM station somewhere here in Laguna makikita mo yung station niya naka ano sa Laguna Lake eh.
Yeah, either sa Laguna Lake or malapit sa mga rice fields. Kasi ang rice fields, alam nila that they're maintained in such a way that they're always wet. So ganun yun, yung AM stations, kasi ang AM station, di ba, it's a tower, but yung tower na yun is actually the element itself already because of the wavelength involved. Yung tower mo is an insulated tower and it's fed at the base. That's why ang daming sangkatutak na insulators yung gayeng niya because your active element is already the tower itself. Pwede mo rin naman yan gawin dito sa atin. You know, kung wala kang aluminum that's 33 feet, then have a mast that's welded 33 feet. Tapos insulate mo, maybe using like a soft drink bottle or something like that. Ituhog mo siya dun. And then yung gayeng mo can be made of rope. You know, that's if you're operating portable, no? You can have soft drink bottle insulator. Tapos saksak mo yung tube mo dun. 33 feet. And then maggayeng ka ng nylon rope. You know, anyway, temporary lang naman yun. So you have a good quarter wave antenna. So like I said, you start with a basic dipole and understand that a quarter wave ground plane antenna is just one half of that dipole because the other half is already earth na yan ground. So once you understand that concept, you're halfway done. Diba? Because all other antennas, yung mga stacked verticals, yung mga co-phased na verticals, those are all derived from either the quarter wave or the dipole. So that's only one formula to remember, diba? Yung 468. 468 divided by frequency in megahertz equals, you know, the length in feet. Pero syempre yun, starting dimensions lang yun. Usually, you'll cut longer tapos you're going to trim. Kasi mahirap mag-cut ng eksakto. And then because of yung environmental variables mo, nagkamali ka na ng sukat and you have to add wire. It's easier na magtanggal ng wire than magdagdag. And again, this also applies to VHF and UHF that try to check or try to tune your antenna already when it's mounted on the final position or as close as you can get to the final position. Because you'll realize that the higher you go, nagbabago na naman yung tuning na antenna mo. That's because yung ground has a certain loading effect. Yung proximity to ground of your antenna has a big effect on the tuning. Manotice mo yan na ito, tinono ko dito sa ground level. Pag inangat mo na siya doon sa final position, tumaas yung tono niya. Diba? The frequency goes up. It will always go up as you raise your antenna away from the ground. So that's one of the sort of rules of thumb when you're tuning an antenna. Try to do it much as you can dun sa final mounting position mo. Because that will take into consideration yung mga environmental variables mo. Meron ka bang water tank na stainless? Meron ka bang metal fence? Meron ka bang screen? Meron ka bang yero na malapit? All those things affect your antenna.
Kaya pala, Angelo, yung iba sa US, nakakapagtono ng plug pole, pare.
Plug pole, oo nga.
Oo, di ba? Kasi may mga nagtotono ng plug pole, pare.
Yung mga discrete na camouflage antenna.
Oh, especially sa US kasi mahigpit yung mga homeowners, di ba? In some communities. So, meron pa nga silang mga flag poles that are made of non-conducting material like fiberglass. Tapos nandun yung alambre nila, nakasiksik sa loob. So it's a disguise. Some of them can use yung gutter ng bahay.
Non-metallic yung roof nila, no?
Yeah, kasi non-metallic. Or sometimes naglalagay sila sa loob ng attic for the same reason na non-metallic yung roof. Pero sa atin, it's partly economics and it's building practice dito na mas common ang yero. Diba? But there's no reason bakit hindi mo pwedeng gamitin yung yero, diba? If you're insulated around and maybe you can experiment on that. But most of the time, you're going to use yung metal roof mo as a ground plane, not as the active element. So yun, when you operate portable, that's the only thing you have to remember. You make use, you maximize your location, and you just, number one, try to know which band and which mode you want to operate. Kasi, excuse me, kung naka-vertical ka, madi-disappoint ka lang kung ang target mo is NVs. Because ang vertical will radiate sideways. And you want something na that will shoot almost straight up. And that only happens when you have a low dipole or a sloper or a horizontal loop. Ito, this is another trivia sa inyo. Di ba yung mga military vehicles, nakikita nyo minsan ito yung vehicle, tapos yung antenna is nakatali siya na gano'n? Oo. I used to think na nakatali lang yun before para makadaan siya sa ilalim ng mga obstruction, like mga bridges or mga underpass, gano'n. But actually, that's an NVIS antenna because you want it to radiate at a steep angle. So that's one thing to think about. If you have a mobile antenna, make or try to get a bracket that can allow you to sort of bend your antenna, make it diagonal. That will help you sa 40.
I see. Angelo, may question ka? Sabi mo kanina.
Ay, oo.
Sorry,
Actually,
layo na ng usapan natin.
Ano
Pero
yan eh,
just guide me na lang.
Kami yung pag may puno, nahuhulog yung antenna.
Tuloy kasi to. I mean, we have to realize that when we're talking about antennas, it's a very vast topic. And honestly, hindi natin siya mako-cover in one session only. If ever in this discussion, magiging effect lang natin is to awaken yung curiosity ng mga tao and realize na there are a lot of household materials or yung mga available sa hardware stores na magagamit natin sa antenna building. That's the fun part. No? Sorry dito, add ko lang. That's probably the best part about building antennas. Kasi if you think about yung building blocks ng station, so you have the power supply, you have the radio, you have the cable, you have the antenna. Of all those factors, siguro you'll agree with me na yung antenna is the single factor that is most important or in deciding yung effectiveness ng station mo. Mm-hmm. It's the antenna because that's where the translation happens from wired to wireless. And ang magandang konsuelo dyan sa atin is it's the antenna na pinakamadaling i-homebrew. Radyo pwedeng i-repair, to an extent. Power supply pwedeng i-repair. Coax, mas okay, bilhin mo na lang. Hindi yan na-homebrew. But you can do, yung mga older hams, you can homebrew yung what they call yung parallel line, yung ladder line, and in some applications that will still apply when you have, a multi-band dipole. For example, yung mga classics, yung mga G5RV, yung mga ZS6 BKW, those are multi-band dipoles which are best fed with open wire line. And kung wala kang mabiling open wire line, you can actually make your own.
Alupan.
Diba? Mag-ano ka lang, mag 3D print ka lang ng mga insulators or just mag-drill ka lang, magputol ka ng chopping board. I've seen that done already. Malaking effort siya, pero it's well worth it, if you're after the experience of learning and that satisfaction of having literally built everything. Diba? But for most of us na, especially sa portable, mahirap ang ladder line sa portable because ang dami mong kailangan iwasan. Yung metal support, bawal siyang i-run sa malapit sa ground. You need, of course, a tuner that can handle an input for balance line. So, bihira na yung mga ganun di ba? But if you're a purist and you want, the full experience of building all the antenna system components, then, by all means, do it. But for portable, most likely, coax na yung gamit mo. Then you'll probably have a 1-to-1 or maybe you'll have yung matunog ngayon, di ba? Yung end-fed half wave because sabi nila, you tune it for the lowest band and then you'll operate on all the harmonics. Di ba? Ganun. So there are several options. But again, the end-fed half wave is basically just a dipole at the lowest frequency. Nalipat lang yung feed point mo. So that's why you have that box, di ba?
Nasa ilalim Oo.
Oo. But in portable operations, very practical lang end-fed half wave kasi yung feed point mo, pwede mong ilapit sa radyo mo. And you can run the wire wherever you want. Iakyat mo muna dito sa puno, tapos ibaba mo ulit papunta dun sa kabila. You know, basta ma-consume mo yung buong length na yon. It doesn't have to be a straight line. Diba? So ganun ang mga options mo ngayon for portable operations. But you have to orient the wire in such a way na ano yung mga areas na tina-target mo. Again, it will take you back to the basics. Ano ba ang radiation pattern ng dipole? Diba? When it's horizontal, yung radiation mo is maximum perpendicular to the wire. Diba? So it's the same thing. Kapag naka-end-fed half wave ka, the physics will still apply. Still perpendicular to the wire. That's why kapag nag-inverted V ka, yung pattern mo, which is yung figure 8 na nakikita natin sa mga libro, nagiging halos omnidirectional na siya because you're bringing the ends closer together. So orientation becomes less critical kapag naka-inverted V ka. Your antenna approaches the omnidirectional pattern. So yun, sorry no, ang daming kailangan tandaan, pero it's it's part of the journey actually. You gain that knowledge, and it's very nice when it becomes parang second nature na sa'yo. Na you arrive at one location, let's say yung mga roadside yung mga provincial road activations mo, di ba? Tabing highway, ano meron diyan? Ito may tower ng napocor dito, wag tayo diyan, di ba? Kalaban
lumalayo
yan.
lumalayo ka.
Kahit nakaka-tempt magtali doon, di ba, na parang ang ganda sloper nito, di ba? Pero di ba? Makita mo na provincial roads, they probably have some of the most outdated electrical distribution equipment. Nandun yung mga transformer na overloaded, nandun yung mga insulator na basag. And di ba tayo pag naghahanap tayo ng noise, di ba? We have that yung AM radio na I think Tito Nash na pagawa ko sa ito Yung AM radio na i-tune mo dun sa bakanting station tapos ihanap mo. Minsan ilapit mo lang dun sa charger ng USB, sa LED lamp, di ba? Tumataas na agad yung noise mo
Madidinig mo siya. Madidinig mo siya. Actually sa
mo talaga.
Ep3DR.
Yeah.
Pag umikot ka, madidinig mo siya kasi meron siyang AM mode.
Yeah. And so what we're trying to develop here is yung mindset na if you want to locate your station at a certain place, check mo muna yung noise. And that's the first step na kailangan mong evaluate mo muna yung noise floor mo kasi useless yung makapag-transmit ka ng malayo. Again, kung hindi mo naman sila maririnig, di ba? Sayang lang pagod mo, sayang lang gastos mo. So, yun, what else?
Ayun, Kuya Angelo,
grounding,
may question ka ba?
Ito na, you're okay with grounding, ha?
Okay na ako
Are
sa
you okay with grounding? RF and DC ground?
Yeah, it's a good paradigm, yung sinasabi mo na always consider what you're hearing, kasi alam ko marami sa atin na always
how far you can talk.
Power, yan, di ba?
Yeah.
Pabibili ng mga Sinash, mahilig bumili ng booster yan. Mas binibenta rin niya.
Masarap lang. Matesting lang.
Society of maling bili, di ba?
So, dito ay syempre nabanggit mo kanina popular yung 40 meter, So what else can we explore? Kasi like yung meron kaming pinag-uusapan, di ba, yung 10 meter band, why don't we use it? Napakalawak na banda, di ba? Pwede natin parang alam mo yun, it's very interesting. But actually 11 meter band nga sa mga nakikinig sa CB, ang dami ng bagong
CB is actually on the way back, it's making a really big comeback, and not for anything, a lot of hams that I know, myself included, nag-start out kami sa CB, but back then yung time ng 80s, CB was an alternative dahil wala masyado pang landline noon, if you'll recall that time. So people weren't getting into it because it was a radio hobby. It was just a means of communication dahil wala pa masyadong landline noon. And unfortunately nabawal lang yan because of martial law, di ba? But as it is now, it's still radio. It's still a hobby that brought many people together, that introduced people into getting licensed as an amateur operator. So it's really nothing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing to bash. It's just also radio. Whatever happens, di ba? And
Okay.
people still enjoy it. It's the hobby. It's the fascination of being wireless, of gaining new friends, and all of that. You know.
CB at a certain level is like an entry level
Ah,
for
audio mo, Nash. Yeah, Nash, mahina yung audio mo.
Okay na ba?
May question ka ba? Oo, mukhang...
So, I was saying, sabi ko, CB is...
Dito parang nawala yung audio mo, Tito Nash.
Mahina. Oo. Baka na-unplug or ano.
Parang lumayo ka masyado.
Oo. Sige, habang nag-aayos si Nash ng kanyang audio.
Tito, magulo ba yung sa analogy, yung sa ground?
Actually, Tito Ari, very
yung the closed circuit analogy.
Yeah, very enlightening nga kasi lagi nating store namin dati, we had an antenna before na na-realize namin kailangan pala it was a vertical na dapat as close to the ground as possible, and then yung radials na dapat pala imbes na stretch mo, dapat pala nakalatag sa ground. May mga ganyang pala, no? So
that's one way kasi hindi na kasi practical na I'll give you a situation, no. For example, meron kang quarter wave vertical for 40 meters. And then gusto mo siyang elevated, let's say on a 20-foot pole, diba? So you have a vertical element that's 33 feet and then you have a mast that's 20 feet. Tapos, yung radials mo will have to be quarter wave. Dun pa lang, sa quarter wave radials na yon, dalawa pa lang makakabuo ka na ng full size na dipole if you had that space. Diba? So why bother with the vertical element? Why bother with the other two radials kung kailangan mo ng 4 or 3 when you can already have a full dipole using those 2 wires supposedly for the radials.
Yeah.
Diba? So alin yung mas practical? Alin yung mas durable? Because when you talk about emergency communications, kung may vertical ka dyan, tapos binagyo yan, you're the first one to go off the air. Then kawawa lang yung emergency preparedness mo. But if you have a low dipole that's protected kahit paano from the wind, then mas lamang ka. For sure, after the storm, you can talk right away. As long as hindi yan mabagsakan ng puno, di ba?
Tama.
And going back to that spirit of being prepared, I'd encourage people to go mobile, to go portable as a rehearsal for that day when your skills will be needed in an emergency situation. Don't wait for the actual emergency to happen for you to realize that you don't have enough power to run your station, or you don't have the right cable to operate portable, or you don't have an easy antenna to set up when the time comes.
Yeah.
So, gawin nyo ng rehearsal yan. Alam ko, si Tito Nash ginagawa niya yan every time na he travels out of town. He tries to operate not only for the fun of it, but deep inside, it's a rehearsal for that day when you could be needed to, for your skills.
Kumbaga parang
practice mo na yun eh.
Oo, practice. Proof of concept, pero parang hinahanap mo yung what works, para you need it, alam mo na kung paano gawin.
Oo.
Hindi kasi, ang mahirap dyan, may audio na ba?
Yes, better.
Audio na ba?
Audio. Ayun, sabi ko kanina, I think tama yung sabi niyo. It's a proof of concept and then at the same time, yung madalas natin sabihin, Angelo, hindi pwede na bumili ka ng radyo, tinago mo sa baol, and then pag emergency na, ang expectation mo is gagana siya. It takes a lot of practice. So that's one. Tapos just another point dun sa CB radio. I think there's no point in hating eh. Sabi nga ni Kuya Ari, it is still radio. And in my opinion, it is like an entry level drug to the hobby, right? It's similar to your Baofengs na diba? Makapasok ka dun sa hobby and then you get excited. Yun lang ang pagkakaiba kasi with the Baofengs. Baofengs are more focused on the 2-meter band, and then you got your CB that's more focused a little bit on the HF band, and you get exposure to DXing. So it's more interesting, at least for me.
Yeah. Well, yun Tito, going back, sa question ni Tito Angelo kanina, what options you can explore, I'd suggest if you want to be operating portable, anyway, you supportable naman, you can choose yung location mo. You try to operate with a full-size dipole because for sure you will not get disappointed. A full-size dipole, even if naka-inverted V yan, uh, tapos meron ka lang, alam mo yung mga painting poles, yung extension na kinakabitan ng roller, yung pag nagpe-paint ng bahay. Maraming ganyan sa sa mga hardwares, the bigger hardwares, no? And you can just have one of those na nandun lang yung feed point mo. So mag-inverted V ka lang. And ang gagawin mo lang naman is put the feed point high enough. Tapos pwede mong itie yan sa bumper mo or something, you mag-improvise ka ng fixture just to have it up. And then yun na, ilatag mo na yung wires mo. You can have them close to the ground if you want. At least that will give you a good NVIS antenna. It might look messy, but it will be very effective. And what's more is if you want to operate on multiple bands, you can just develop that single dipole into a fan dipole, what we call a fan dipole, di ba? The fan dipole has a common insulator and feed point, but with parallel elements. So you have a wire for 40, you have a wire for 20, you have a wire for 10. So lahat yan, common yung feed point. Why did I not mention 15? Because, di ba, binilang mo ba yung banda? So 15 can be tuned using yung 40 meters because 15 is the third harmonic. Diba? 21 megahertz is 7 times 3. So being an odd number, that means your feed point impedance will also be low because you're feeding the dipole at a high current point. When, diba, it's Ohm's law na when your feed point has a low impedance, that means your voltage is low, but your current is high. Unlike sa end-fed half-wave, which is the opposite. Your voltage is high because it's the end of the dipole, and your current is low. That's why kailangan mo ng 49:1 because yung 50 ohms mo becomes translated to 50 times 49, which is about 4,000 something. Because dulo na ng dipole yun eh. You're feeding the wire at a high voltage point. But if you feed your dipole at the center, you're feeding it at a high current point, which is closer to the normal cable value, which is 50. So ganun, no? Try, for all of those na gusto mag-experiment with antennas, whether it's HF, VHF, or 2 meter, understand the current and voltage distribution in a dipole. And from there, you will grow. You will imagine all sorts of things. You will grow your antenna knowledge instantly.
Parang nakikita ko, Tito Ari, from you, parang nabivisualize mo na siguro kung paano yung flow ng current sa isang antenna, parang siguro na-develop mo na yung ganyang parang skill,
Parang lang, Tito, since alam mo naman na yung length ng wire mo, relative to the wavelength, and you'll always remember na yung current is maximum at the center. It's the same way na when you're building a Yagi, for example. Bakit yung ibang Yagi makers, nakadirekta sa boom, yung center ng elements, right? Sabi nila, it's okay to mount your elements directly to the boom without any insulation. Why? Because the center of the element is a low voltage point. It's practically zero at the center, but current is maximum. So your boom being connected to your mast and your mast being connected to the ground, that's ideally a zero voltage point or a low voltage point, diba? Practically zero. So it's okay to ground your element at the center if you're talking about the dipole. See? So, ganun, no? It's again, we were talking about just a Yagi, but the Yagi is actually derived from a dipole. It only has some elements that are longer and shorter,
Yeah,
but you still
one
have a
becomes like the
dipole.
radiating at saka the reflecting, diba?
Reflect, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
actually
so
interesting no, Angelo,
the
kasi
rector.
yeah, interesting kasi remember from our conversation with Kuya Jason last week, he was also talking about the dipole. If you want to make an antenna, start with the most basic, which is the dipole, and then if you want to make it directional,
Like
you
kanyang
add a reflector, and then eventually you add a director. So which is quite interesting. Na even at HF,
Yeah.
the concept is still the same. You start with the dipole, and then eventually you start adding the elements.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about kanina sa umpisa, na the physics, the rules don't change. It's just the size. Diba? And talking about size, let's go back to the physical length and the electrical length. Diba? Because we have several formulas, no? Okay.
Oo nga, dalawa yung
I'm
formula, Kuya Ari, di ba? Yung
oh,
tinatanong ko
yun,
sa'yo kanina, sabi ko, bakit dalawa yung formula sa pag-measure ng
okay.
antenna size?
Yeah, I'll explain it as much as, as well as I hope I can, no? Okay, ganito yun. For example, Tito Nash, you're building a Yagi. So you have the formula for finding out yung driven element muna, di ba? Yun yung 468 divide by frequency in megahertz. And then makukuha mo yung dipole dimensions sa feet. Okay, but when you're talking about a Yagi, meron siyang what you call the element spacings. Okay, now element spacings, there's no conductor in between. For example, the director and the driven, or the driven and the reflector. So that is what they call the free space value. Free space wavelength simply means the actual wavelength traveling, when the signal travels through the air. So negligible na yung computation natin for practical reasons, no? We're not in a vacuum, but this is like a real world value already. Because the 468 formula takes into account yung speed of your electrical signal when it's traveling through your element. So it's slightly slower than the free space value, which is natural, di ba? Kasi something will travel through the air faster than when it travels through a solid medium. Di ba? That's basic physics eh. So the term for that is what we call yung velocity factor. So different materials, in this case, no, different conducting materials have different velocity factors. So yung quarter wavelength mo in space is different quarter wavelength when you're measuring it for a wire. Diba? So, okay, I'll yung dalawang formula na yan, dadagdagan ko lang siya ng isa pa. Okay, tatawad ako. When you're computing yung free space wavelength, for example, ng 7 megahertz, for example, it doesn't mean na i-double mo lang yung 468. Okay? Because what happens there is, yung 468 nga, meron na siyang velocity factor ng wire or ng element which is considered, which is about 95, roughly about 95 to 96%. So, what that means is, yung bilis ng signal mo is 95 or 96% slower pag dumaan na siya doon sa element as compared to pag dumadaan siya through air. Okay, so the formula for free space is 984, or to be exact, 983.58 divided by frequency in megahertz. So that will give you the free space wavelength. Why do we need the free space value when we're doing element spacings? Diba? Element spacings, for example, driven to reflector, you want to go somewhere between 0.25 to 0.18 of a wavelength. Then, dun ka kukuha ng free space value. First, find out muna which is your free space wavelength. Tapos, yun yung kukunan mo ng fraction. 0.25 or 1/4 or 0.2 or 0.18 or 0.15. because that's the actual distance that your signal travels from your driven to your reflector. Dumadaan siya between, it's just air in between your elements. So you use the free space value. Pero when you're computing an element length, then that's when you consider, okay, this is interesting. If you have a calculator, Tito Nash, or Tito Angelo, so we have that frequency, computation of frequency and wavelength, no? You try 983.58.
Okay.
Diba? If you divide by 2, supposedly you're computing for half wave, diba? So what's 984 divided by 2?
491.
About 497. About 492, diba?
Yeah.
So kung titignan mo yan, ang layo from the 468 that
Yes.
we're trying to use when we build half-wave dipoles. But you try to multiply 492 by about 0.96 or 0.95. Ano lalabas?
7.2.
467. Very near to
Oh.
468.
468, diba?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 468 is actually the value or the formula that already takes into account the speed of your radio signal while it's still traveling through your element.
Okay. Interesting.
Yun
Interesting.
yung velocity
Yun lang.
factor.
Yun lang.
Okay.
That's velocity factor. Diba?
Oh.
And when we buy coax, when we're trying to make a harness, for example, you buy 75 ohm coax if you want to combine two 50 ohm loads, diba? You want that impedance transformation property of the quarter wave coax. So, yung length mo ng coax will be influenced by the velocity factor. So, sasabihin nila, that's published by the manufacturer. So, for example, Belden will say, this is yung solid dielectric or solid insulator cable. Velocity factor is 0.66. But if it's the lower loss foam insulation, it's about 0.81. So you see, your wave travels different, different speeds depending on the cable. So doon pumapasok yun when you're computing for lengths that are frequency dependent. And you only use that when you're making impedance transformers or things that will go between your transmission line and your antenna.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Sorry, ang daming math.
May math na.
Hindi, pero this is a good this is a good foundational knowledge.
But
kasi
but
this gives me an
you know
idea
where
in terms of
where the formula comes from, di ba?
Yeah.
So now
wavelength,
so now it becomes instinctive sa'yo. What if example you're given a mystery antenna, hindi mo alam kung saan banda, you're given something that's old, tapos wala na siyang label, wala ka ng specs na mahanap sa internet, then just sukatin mo, measuring tape, measure the elements. That should give you, kasi ngayon spoiled na di ba? Sabihin, hanapin mo lang sa analyzer yan, makakapa mo yan. Di ba?
Google mo lang
analyzer.
o kaya itanong mo sa group.
Di ba kasi dati wala naman analyzer. Pag gusto mo magtono, iaakyat mo yung buong setup mo sa bubong, di ba? Power supply, radyo, coax. But now, medyo spoiled na yung mga generation ngayon. Meron kang nano VNA, meron kang, di ba, meron ka pang modeling program, meron ka pa kung ano-ano dyan. But, all these things are meaningless if you don't have the basic understanding na your antenna should behave as an antenna, not as a transmission line. And in the same way, your transmission line should not be radiating or should not be picking up signals. It should just be transferring power from point A to point B. Kasi kung bumabato yung transmission line, then there's something wrong with your
And
setup.
that, folks, is the reason behind studying for the license. Kasi without knowing the theory, without knowing the technicals of it, we might end up interfering with other stations or other people or other devices na lang pala, di ba?
Sorry, I'll add to that. It's not only that Tito Angelo, but if I may add, it will help us enjoy the hobby more and be more supportive to each other, no? That we try to contribute uh, the little knowledge that we have, to make this hobby ano naman, based on science naman. Kasi we're dealing with high technology equipment, di ba? Now you have digital modes, you have this and that, but it still goes home to radio. It's still wireless, and there's a lot of science behind that. And let's not get carried away, no. A lot of people are misled by the fact that just because ginastusan mo yung setup mo, binili mo yung top of the line na HF transceiver, it's not a guarantee that you'll get the best DX. It's not a guarantee that you'll be the most powerful station in the neighborhood or in the country or in the region. It will still boil down to the choices that you make and the informed decisions that you make when you buy your antenna, where you set it up, how you set it up. So there's a lot to learn. Maybe a little bit of math and a lot of experimentation, a lot of asking other hams what works for them and how they work around certain problems, most especially noise, how they work around space limitations. There's a lot to learn and there's a lot to experiment
Okay.
on. Yeah.
Thank you, Tito Ari. I was about to ask you about the concluding statement, but I think that sums it up pretty well. Na alam mo na yun, it's about learning, knowing the fundamentals, experimenting, knowing your environment, and of course, enjoying the hobby. Okay, so folks, this has been a very interesting discussion, and alam mo sa tama ka, Tito Ari, we might spend the whole night talking about technicals, and the audience will also, I think, be interested in this. Pero siguro, maybe we can discuss it in other parts as well. And nandiyan ka lang naman sa group, and tatanong kami sa'yo pag kami makatanungan pa.
Well, I hope nasagot ko yung mga tanong ninyo dito. And no pun intended, pero when you talk about HF antennas, mahabang usapan talaga yan.
Literally. Okay, so
Tito Nash, thank you.
You enjoyed the show today, and marami pa akong tanong pero overwhelmed din, but enlightened in a way, in many ways. So this has been Angelo for I1REC, aka N2RAC. Wala na akong masabi dahil dinadigest ko pa yung lahat ng information na yan. Ipapasa ko na kay Tito Nash for the concluding words.
Awesome. So first off, I'd like to thank Kuya Ari for giving us the opportunity to interview you here in Radyo Kape. And
Anytime,
also shout out doon sa mga kasama natin kay DV1 Kilo, kay Kuya J Ocampo. Maraming alam ko busy kayo ngayon kaya hindi kayo nakasama. But definitely I know this session is dedicated to you guys kahit wala kayo dito. And also again this is N4SHX, also known as 4E1 FLD, saying 73 mabuhay, together with 4I1 BBL and N2RAC 4I1 RAC, saying magandang gabi po sa inyo lahat. And if meron po kayong comment, message lang po kayo sa baba. Paalam.